I want to begin this morning by saying some concluding things concerning the New International Version. I said that it has received almost unqualified approval of almost every evangelical scholar who's been asked about it. Many of the evangelical type churches are switching to the New International Version as a pulpit and pew Bible. But there have been a few reviews which have been published that have been very critical of the New International Version. And sometimes it was because maybe the authors of the reviews weren't right themselves, but I think sometimes they were. For instance, I just want to read just the first paragraph or so of a review that appeared in the fall 1986 edition of one of the theological journals. And the title of it is Dynamic Equivalence and Some Theological Problems in the NIV. And this author, Scott, writes, the translators of the New International Version have moved away from the principle of literal translation more than most evangelicals had previously been willing to move. Now, others were willing to go away from that and add and subtract, but not your dyed-in-the-wool evangelicals. They adopted a more idiomatic and sometimes even paraphrastic approach, seeking to convey the meaning of the original in contemporary English style. There is certainly much to be said for such an approach. However, a high level of exegetical and literary skill is required for the successful execution of it. If translators do not understand the original text particularly well, then a free translation of it will ordinarily convey less of the original meaning and introduce more spurious meaning than will a literal one. He goes on to say, in other words, the reality of dynamic equivalence may turn out to be more dynamics than equivalence. It may be dynamic, but it may not be the word, though. A more readable, quote-unquote, translation may sacrifice substance to style. Now here's what I really wanted to read, just a couple of sentences. These dangers are, one regrets to say, all too often realized in the New International Version, which is exactly what I've said, that in their desire and their quest for readability and for style, there are occasions when you study, as I have especially done with 1 John, the New International Version with the Greek text, not some other translation, but with one of the standard Greek texts, you find just a host of things left out or added. Now, they're not going to leave out the blood or add in evolution or something like that. They're many times small words, but they completely change the meaning of the sentence. I remember giving you one of those in Galatians 2, I think it might have been verse 16, a number of years ago. And I don't have time to give you all those problems. They popped up in the past, and I'm sure they'll continue to pop up in the future, that the NIV has very definite problems. I like what he said here, that the reality of dynamic equivalence may turn out to be more dynamics than equivalence. As a result of simplification and paraphrase, the fine points of Scripture are sometimes lost, and these details are sometimes theologically important. Now, he points out some things that he thinks are details which have been lost in the NIV. I happen to disagree with his examples. It's interesting how someone can be on the right trail, but they end up chasing too many rabbits as they go. And he's got maybe a little over 10 pages, about 12 pages. I agree with his introduction, but I disagree with his examples. He's totally wrong there. The NIV happens to be right in the examples that he chooses to pull out and say that the NIV is wrong. He's dealing with the subject of baptism, by the way, in that article. And the fellow writing the article believes in infant baptism. So he already has a bias in that area. So he just rakes the NIV over the coals for introducing wrong prepositions when it comes to baptism in the book of Acts. Well, the fellow Scott, who's writing the article, is wrong there. He already has an unscriptural bias in favor of infant baptism, which the New Testament does not teach. And the people behind the NIV, for the most part, would be people who believe in what we call believer's baptism. And they translate the prepositions right. So he doesn't like that. That's a bad example, I would say, to give. I've given you other examples, Galatians 2, around verse 16, and I know there are just many. You could find probably one in every chapter, leaving out ands or buts or nors or and that can change the meaning of the passage. So there's one negative review. Now here's another review that I read of the NIV. I'm saying that for the most part, the NIV has been praised by people, but some people have not liked the New International Version. You have to listen closely to this review. This author, I'll quote, says that the New International Version is tinctured throughout with the erroneous doctrines of original sin, heredity, depravity, the restoration of national Israel, premillennialism, and predestination. Well, I suppose that's a good review of the NIV right there. If it contains all of those things, that's a good review. Obviously, the person writing that view is just anti-Bible, anti-truth. So he's going to be anti, any version that comes out, but especially the New International Version, since it is a fundamental evangelical type translation. Now, an ad came out here a couple of years ago, whenever the whole, well, not that many years ago, a few years after the whole New International Version was available, that has been highly contested, published by Zondervan. Of course, the Bible was published by Zondervan. The ad was published by Zondervan in their attempt to market the New International Version. And I've had this with me for a long time, a couple of years, I guess, since this came out. And I tried to use these examples just to back up what I've already said about the horrible plague of advertising and what we call framing in advertising in this country. I said before, several years ago, I believe, on ethics tapes, we were dealing with the question of the doctrine of truthfulness versus dishonesty, that only about 110% of the time are advertisers dishonest. Only about 110% of the time are ads dishonest. They inevitably contain lies and innuendos that are wrong and suggestions that are wrong, and the whole framing of them is a lie. Now here is an article. You can see this royal crown filled with jewels here on the bottom. All right, now I'm going to have to read you what the statement is once you see the crown with jewels. The statement reads, if King James were alive today, the crown represents him, he would read the NIV. They're trying to overtake the KJV with this type of advertising here. If King James were alive today, he would read the NIV. Well, of course, the people who publish the King James Version, the people who read the King James Version, have been highly upset with this article. It's been a very contested ad by Zondervan, because I think what we have here is they are making a totally unsupportable claim. That's pure hypothesis of theirs. And let me just go a step further and make several comments about this ad. I sat down when I first saw this ad when it came out. If King James were alive today, he would read the NIV. And here's some thoughts I have about this ad, just to show you how deceptive, and this is Zondervan. By the way, Zondervan was just purchased by, who was that? Not Simon & Schuster. What's another one of the big New York publishing companies? What? No, not Macmillan. What's another one? Harper & Row. Just published or purchased by Harper & Row. Zondervan. I mean, they sold out. A Christian publishing company sold out to a secular giant here. It just happened like a month or a few weeks ago. And there's no telling what's going to come from the presses of Zondervan now. They sold out because they can make some money. The owners of the company could make some money by selling to a secular publisher like Harper & Row in New York. Well, anyway, here's some comments and some thoughts that came to me when I first read this article. And thinking of this phrase, this claim, they're making this claim, and they're trying to sell their Bible over and above the King James Version with this claim, if King James were alive today, then he would read the NIV. By the way, the very article shows, by implication, shows the Bible to attack if you want to attack one. Notice they're not attacking the RSV or anything else. They know the Bible that sells the best. It's the King James Version. All right, here are my thoughts, and you think about this to show you how deceptive advertising is. Number one, if King James, as we know him, were alive today, of course he would not read the NIV. It would read like a foreign language to him. If King James were alive, now King James were alive, of course he would read the King James Version. That's Elizabethan English. That's the only type of English he would understand. He would know what you mean when you drop your saiths and runneth, your THs to the end of your verbs. He would know what's going on. So not only are they making an unsupportable claim, they're making a claim that is patently false. If King James, now that's what they say, if King James were alive today, he would not read the New International Version, or the Living Bible, or today's English version. He'd read Wycliffe or Tyndale or the KJV, some form of English that he could understand. Secondly, if you mean by this ad some sort of modern King James, now that's kind of, I think, what they mean. King James wouldn't read the NIV. Well, if it was some type of modern King James, well, of course he would read the NIV. But you haven't said anything then, though. So would everybody else who's birthed into this culture. It'd make better sense to him. And then a third point I would say about this ad, let's turn the whole matter around. If Zondervan and the NIV were available in 1611, the king's men would chuck the NIV and read the KJV. It's just all a matter of perspective here. We could also say, yeah, and if the NIV was around in 1611, no one would read it. Why? No one could understand it. The king's men would chuck the NIV and they would stay with the KJV, something that they could understand. But I think it's a patently false claim that if King James were alive today, he would read the NIV. He would not read the NIV. He could not understand the NIV. He couldn't even pronounce the word Zondervan, probably. He couldn't pronounce the word New International Version, probably. He would have to stay with his old form, his old language. So it's patently false. I mean, they're just playing on, the picture here, this beautiful, beautiful monarch's crown here, and this catchy thought, yeah, if King James were alive, then he would read the NIV. It's a patently false bit of advertising. But whenever you've said that, you haven't said much, because that's the same as all advertising. It's just too bad that we had to find the old methods of the secular Antichrist world out there infiltrating the church, as those methods often do. Everywhere from advertising to evangelism, to public speaking. The methods of the world, the methods of the secular Antichrist, anti-Bible, anti-truth world out there somehow find their way into the church. Rather than the church winning the world has done very, very well in winning the church to its side. And there's one example. And here now I find out, and this just happened, this article or ad goes back a few years ago, but now I find out, and it just, it's just like what you would expect, that Zondervan has sold out a Christian publishing company. You've sold out now. Your board of directors are a bunch of pagans and atheists. And they're going to have final say over what's published. Now, to be sure, those guys, since they are pagans and atheists, they're in it for the money. And if they can continue to print Christian books that sell enough money, then they're going to continue printing Christian books. They're going to make money whatever way. They don't care how they make it. But I know what way Christian publishing companies often make money. They write the most ridiculous, stupid books, like, how to receive counseling, for yourself or something. The most ridiculous, stupid books. Not anything on good theology or where you can really learn the Word, but all these self-help books and diet books and image books and how to dress successfully books and all of this. That's what you'll find coming from Zondervan. And I guess we'll have to go to one of the other publishing companies still owned by believers to get our theological, biblical material. That's too bad. That's too bad of a comment, I guess, on the New International Version, to have to stoop to those depths of lies and insinuations and innuendos and half-truths and mistruths and white lies just to try to sell your Bible. I don't want to have anything to do with that type of world. All right, let's come in this morning to our last two Bible translations that we're going to be discussing. Numbers 49 and 50. Numbers 49 and 50. Now, they don't go together. They're two entirely different translations, but I just want you to know that we'll be ending with that part of our study this morning. Now, I didn't end on 50 purposely. Like 50 is a nice, good, solid number there, halfway between 1 and 100. It just came out that way. There are probably 50 translations, as you already know, that we skipped over because they just weren't worth discussing. And we discussed a few in our 50 that weren't worth discussing as well. Many of them. So I'm sure you're glad we're not going to go to 100 or 150 or something like that. I guess if you've done 50, you've done enough. You have a totally complete representation of anything imaginable that's available out there or probably that will be available in the future. So I know that I haven't said everything about every translation. I haven't even covered all of them. But I think that 50 is enough. Number 49. Number 49, Zondervan's NIV goes back to late 70s, 1978. Now we come up into the 1980s. Number 49, entitled A New Translation of the Holy Scriptures According to the Masoretic Text. A new translation of the Holy Scriptures according to the Masoretic text. The date is 1982, and it's often called Tanakh, T-A-N-A-K-H, and this is what it looks like. Of course, it is a Jewish Bible, so it is only an Old Testament. The Law, the Prophets, and the Writings. Tanakh, T-A-N-A-K-H. Taking some of the letters that belong to each of the Hebrew terms, the Law, Torah, the Prophets, Nevim, and the Writings, Ketuvim. You take some of the letters from each and you get this acronym, Tanakh, T-A-N-A-K-H. 1982, but its technical real name is A New Translation of the Holy Scriptures According to the Masoretic Text. This is a Jewish Bible. On the back, it has been praised by such organizations as the Biblical Archaeology Society of the United States. It has been praised by the Biblical Archaeology Review. It's been praised by the New York Times, by Time Magazine, and so forth. Now, we need to give a little background history to Jewish publication in general. Now, way back when we first began this journey of looking at these 50 Bible translations, we discussed one, number 9. Number 9. We're on 49 now. That was 40 translations ago. Number 9, which was done in 1917. And it was called the Holy Scriptures, according to the Masoretic text. Now, for most of this century, that has been the dominant English Bible for non-Christian Jews. Now, you have to get all those words. That's been the dominant English Bible. Of course, some of the Jews in this country can read Hebrew, so they don't need any English translation of their Holy Scriptures. They can read in the original. But that has been, from 1917, for most of this century, the Holy Scriptures according to the Masoretic text of 1917 was the dominant English Bible for non-Christian Jews. Now, if you're a Christian Jew, then you'd probably use one of the, standard Christian translations, like an ASV or KJV or RSV or something. You wouldn't use a Jewish one. If for no other reason, the Jewish one won't have your New Testament. And if you're a Christian Jew, you're very concerned about your New Testament. You're not going to be reading a Jewish Bible then. Now, that was basically the work of one man, Morris Jastrow. I gave all this to you before, but you just need to write it down again or listen again so I can set this Bible over against that one. It was the work of Morris Jastrow, J-A-S-T-R-O-W. And what it amounted to was a touching up of the Tyndale KJV ASV tradition. Now, the RSV, of course, wasn't published. You'll probably recall that the RSV was the last of the great major Bibles in the Tyndale, what we call the Tyndale tradition. But it was a touching up of the Tyndale KJV ASV tradition that sold, about 1 million copies. Not a whole lot between 1917 and 1980. About 1 million copies. That means not a lot of American Jews are reading their Bible, or have been over the last 3/4 of a century. Now, notice the name of this translation we're talking about right now. A new translation of the Holy Scriptures according to the Masoretic text. The old Bible was simply the Holy Scriptures according to the Masoretic text. So obviously this is some type of revision of the 1917 work. Like the American Standard Version and the New American Standard Bible for a Protestant evangelical work. We had for the Jews the Holy Scriptures according to the Masoretic text, done under the man Jastrow in 1917, and now in 1982 we have a new translation of the Holy Scriptures according to the Masoretic text. Now, by the midpoint of this century, somewhere in the 1950s, Jewish scholars felt that they too needed an accurate contemporary translation for American synagogues and for English-speaking Jews. If the 1917 Jewish translation followed the Tyndale KJV ASV tradition. That means it was not in the language of the common man. It was in an older form of English. And so, in other words, what's happening in the minds of these Jewish scholars is the same thing happening with a lot of the Protestant people, as well as even the Catholic people. We've got to put something in contemporary English here. We've got to have a translation that's available for American synagogues and English-speaking Jews, that it is in an idiom that they can read and appreciate and identify with. And so they're doing the same thing in the mid-part of this century that other Protestants and Roman Catholics are doing. And so, under the leadership of Harry Orlinsky, now you probably recall his name from several places before. He was the unsaved, unregenerate Jewish worker on the RSV's committee, Harry Orlinsky. And he worked on another of the translations that we discussed. A world-renowned Jewish scholar, especially a Jewish Septuagint scholar. Now I say under his leadership, he wasn't the man doing it, like Jastrow pretty much translated those portions of the Bible back in 1917 himself. But this was under the leadership of Harry Orlinsky. This new translation of the Holy Scriptures according to the Masoretic text was begun, and the first of 3 parts came out in 1963, which was entitled The Torah, the 5 Books of Moses. You know, this is the standard procedure for Bible translations. You don't wait until you have the whole thing. You publish the New Testament when you've got it, and the Old when you've got it, and then the whole thing in one, between 2 covers whenever you have it. Or you publish so many books, you know, like a half a dozen or a dozen books of the Old, or 8 or 10 of the New, or whatever. Well, it would only make sense, since the Jews do divide their Old Testament up into 3 divisions, the Law, the Prophets, and the Writings, to publish those separately as they're available and as they are ready. So in 1963, they published the Torah, the 5 Books of Moses. Part 2, the Prophets, or the Nephim, came out in 1978. Took a lot of time to get through with the Prophets. Part 2 came out in 1978. Now, I have some of these single editions. Now I happen to own a whole Jewish Bible here. And this is fairly new, as you'll see. But I had some of just the parts of it. That's all the Jews had, you know, in the late 1960s and early 70s. They either could go back to their 1917 Jewish Bible in the English tongue, or they could just say, well, I'll stay with the modern, but all you have are the 5 Books of Moses. Now, after 1978, you have the Prophets. And in the final segment, the Writings, was published in June of 1982. And then shortly after that, like the next year, a 1-volume edition. A 1-volume edition of the whole New Jewish Bible. Sometimes it's just called the New Jewish Bible, so you don't have to say a new translation of the Holy Scriptures according to the Masoretic text. Or it's best just to call it Tanakh. So you've got an acronym that's an abbreviation for the Law, the Prophets, the Writings, Torah, Nephim, Ketuvim. All right, Time magazine even carried a feature story on it in its religion section on July the 5th, 1982. I have that in my file somewhere, but I remember Time magazine carried a story that the Jews in America, English-speaking Jews, American synagogues, finally have an up-to-date contemporary translation for the Jews of the Old Testament into idiomatic English. July the 5th, 1982. The work was done by American Jewish scholars. I'm not going to give you all the details. They've got a long preface in the beginning. Well, I say long. I mean, it's several pages. It looks like about 5 or 6 pages on the history of Bible translation, on the making of the new translation, and just date after date and name after name. If you want to know all that, you can buy the Bible. I'll just sum it up for you. It's the work of American Jewish scholars. It was sponsored by the Jewish Publication Society of America, which also sponsored Jastrow's 1917 work. Sponsored by the Jewish Publication Society of America, which was founded in 1888. We discussed that society and we did number 9, the Bible translating work. And it has the official ecclesiastical approval of all 3 branches of modern Judaism. It has the official approval by the leaders of all three branches of modern Judaism. What are those branches, someone? What's the name of the three Jewish branches? If you can name some American Protestant denominations, what are the Jews called? Orthodox? Reform? Now, before you even think of the other, don't even think of that. Look at those two names there. I mean, good names. Orthodox, the Orthodox Jews, Reformed Jews. You know what, Reformed in Protestantism is? You go back to Calvin and Luther, and you don't believe any of that Roman Catholic medieval superstition. Those are two good names. Guess what? Those are two liberal groups of Jews. The Orthodox Jews and the Reformed Jews are two liberal groups. Well, you've got one liberal, the Orthodox, and the Reform are kind of, middle of the road. And then what's the other group? Conservative. And they happen to be the only conservative Jews. When I say conservative, I mean they're not buying out on all this, the new evidence and higher criticism about the Old Testament, Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch and all that. A lot of Jews, they bought out for the new theories now. So I find those three names, in other words, those are all three what we would call conservative names. Orthodox, Reform, and Conservative. I wouldn't mind being called any of those things. I guess I like that name conservative better, because that's really an abrasive word in the modern world. If people read that you're conservative. Orthodox, that kind of sounds like Greek Orthodox or something, so you can be kind of liberal and be Orthodox. But Orthodox, Reform, and Conservative. I've always thought it was interesting that the three branches of Judaism have such good names when they're not all good. Now, what this Bible is an historic work that I would say will become the official accepted Bible of Jews in America. English-speaking Jews probably anywhere. This will become their official Bible. Now, I'm not going to say you have to run out and buy one, but if you're going to be witnessing any Jews who read their Bible, this is probably the Bible that they're going to own. Now, a whole lot of Jews aren't even going to own a Bible. They might own some little prayer cards or a prayer wheel or some beads or some caps or some candles or some lampstands or something, but they may not even own their Bible. They'll own some reading so they can read Passover section at the right time of the year and all this. But this is going to become the standard official accepted Bible for Jews in America and perhaps Jews who speak English in other places. Now, actually, it is the first, this is the big statement, first Bible translation done by a panel of Jewish scholars since the Septuagint. Wow. Over 2 millennia ago. That's why I say it's an historic work. Jastrow did his work pretty much on his own. This is the first Bible translation done by a panel of Jewish scholars. Remember, there was 70 men, and they did it in 70 days, how the letter of Aristeas legend tells us the origin of the Septuagint, the LXX. Well, that we know was done. It might not have been done by 70 men in 70 days. I think that's a lot of nonsense and some fables being read into it, but it was done by a panel of Jewish scholars over a period of years, not in 70 days, not locked up on the island of with the lighthouse and everything translating. But it was the first one to be done since the LXX 2 millennia ago. The Jews just haven't been into translating the Bible. I mean, they're slower than the Roman Catholics. It took the Roman Catholics centuries and centuries before they did anything. And they really only started doing something because the Protestants called their hand and forced them to do something. And then in modern times, we've gone a long time. They just stay with Latin and stay with Latin and stay with Latin. And so we've seen they finally changed that. And the more recent Roman Catholic editions go back to the original languages and not to a secondary language like Latin. Well, the Jews are even slower. They're even slower. They're just now, 1982, after over 2,000 years, translating their Bible again. I say a panel of Jewish scholars. Well, some readings in it. It happens to have the support of all branches of Judaism. But, I mean, let's face the facts of modern society. Modern man is liberal. Modern man is liberal. He's non-conservative. He's non-traditional. And so you would like to think that this was done by people who were born Jews, Hebrew scholars. And they didn't have to mess around with Hebrew and Greek or something like, Protestant or Roman Catholic translators were. You got to kind of know both languages. All you have to know is Hebrew and a little Aramaic here. You'd think this is surely the most reliable translation you can find. Well, you wouldn't want to bet your life on that. You'd want to stay with the ASV or NASB or KJV or NIV, a Protestant translation, before you'd want to stay with this Jewish one. Because when they have the opportunity, some liberal things slip in, such as Genesis 1:1. I should say Genesis 1 verses 1 to 3. The way they have that verse set up, the old argument there, that's not the creation of the world, that's the recreation of the world after some pre-creation ruin and fall and chaos, and God brought order out of the chaos and all of this. I don't know exactly what all, or at least the majority of the translators of this Tanakh believe about the creation account, but I don't think they believe what you and I believe. The way they set it up, I believe it's with, if I remember the verse, they have some hyphens in there. Yeah, verse 2 is hyphenated from verse 1, and then a hyphen is between it and verse 3. So it reads like this: when God began, and here we got that word began. When God began to create, what that I said before years ago in creation studies, what that does is it leaves room for evolution. When God began to create, now He didn't just create it in 6 consecutive 24-hour days. He began it. So God, maybe, you can get theistic evolution out of that. God kind of began the process, and He set things in motion, but then things just kind of developed themselves later. And then they have a note down in the margin. It says, in the beginning God created. They leave out that old word began. So they say this is what others have to say about this verse. But they read, when God began to create heaven and earth, hyphen. And whenever He began to create it, here's what it was before He began to create it. The earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the water, then a hyphen, and then they go back into when God began to create. In other words, what they're really doing is saying you should skip verse 2 and reading the creation account. It reads, when God began to create the heaven and the earth, and God said, let there be light. And verse 2 is something totally different that happened earlier. It's kind of like the gap theory. It's kind of a Jewish version of the gap theory, or one of these theistic evolutionary ideas. And they don't really tell us, well, how did that unformed and void earth get there to begin with? We're not told that. We're just told what happened when God took what was already existing and began to bring order out of chaos. Many so-called Christians believe that, and it looks like the translators of this Jewish Bible believe that as well. And you'll find other occasions of just utter nonsense like that. And speaking of utter nonsense, here's the translation. It's a good one, though. But they use the word utter futility. In Ecclesiastes 1, verses 2 and 3, the Jewish Bible translates that, utter futility, said Kohelet, utter futility. All is futile. We've been accustomed to vanity of vanities there. Utter futility, said Kohelet, utter futility, all is futile. What real value is there for man in all the gains he makes beneath the sun? That's a real good translation there. They simply transliterated one of the Hebrew terms. In the KJV, I think he's called the preacher. Here he's called the Kohelet, but because a Kohel was an assembly of Jews meeting together, and so Kohelet was their leader, was the one who would lead them. And sometimes in scholarly writings, whenever you come across the book of Ecclesiastes, you'll even find it under that name, Kohelet. You won't even find it under Ecclesiastes. Koheleth. I think it's the way they spell it. Now, if you'll turn over just quickly in your Bible to Deuteronomy chapter 6, I found this translation to be very interesting, especially being done by Jewish people. Oh my. To ever tamper with the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:4, is just amazing. And what they give us is a Christian translation. And you'll see what I mean. You know what the Shema is? S-H-E-M-A. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. And you'll love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and so forth. And Jesus quotes that in the New. Whenever they ask, what's the great commandment? Well, he said, Hear, O Israel. He quotes that. The Lord our God is one Lord. And you're to love him with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Well, of course, this has been probably the classic, well, it has been, the classic, because they don't have a lot of others they can depend on, the classic Jewish text for Jewish ethical monotheism, what we call ethical monotheism. That is the belief in the existence of only one God. Now, what's one of the big problems Jews to this day have with Christians? Well, they're polytheists. They believe in three gods. They believe in a trinity, three gods. And Jews believe in one God. That's one thing that's distinguished them down through the ages, is what we call theological or ethical monotheism, the belief in one God. And this has been their chief proof text. Now, you see, they've got problems with some of their other passages, like the first verse in the Bible, in the beginning God. It happens to be a plural name, Elohim, for God there. Or when you get down into verse 26 of Genesis 1, let us make man in our image. And they've had a problem with those plural pronouns, us and our there. But one verse they've had that they could stand on, that was a major verse for them. And Jesus even shows us how major of a verse it was, because it was a major verse for him. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and you're to love him with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And it's this word one. Hear, O Israel, that the Lord our God is one Lord, not three. That he is one Lord. Well, people who know Hebrew know that that word one is an ambiguous term. It can have more meanings than uno, one, as in one apple or one orange or one tree versus two or three or four. Just one. It can have other meanings than that. And so here's how they translate it. They give it one of its other meanings. And whenever I cannot believe that they've done this. Whenever they've done this, they've taken away their classic proof text for monotheism. And they've left room for the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Can't you see how one word in maybe several languages could mean one and alone? Because alone kind of has the meaning of one, but then again, it doesn't necessarily mean one. The Lord is our God. Now, what that says there is the Lord is our God. The Lord is our God. We still have plural words right here in this passage. The Lord is our God, the Lord alone, instead of he's one. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. The meaning has been changed here. The Lord is our God, the Lord alone. In other words, they're not saying that there aren't other gods. They're just saying that this is our God. They're not saying that God is one, but that we worship this one who is our God. And yet you've got the word God right in the passage, which is a plural term. Well, I don't know if that's registering on you, but that's a remarkable change for the Jews, to strike out that word one and put in the word alone. I guess you can see how that leaves room for there being a distinction, a plurality in the Godhead. We're not bound by that word one, that our God is one, but that he is our Lord alone. Like he's our Lord, we don't have others. Or maybe it means this, that he is our Lord alone, and he doesn't belong to others. He's only the God of Israel. Now, if that's the way it's to be understood, then you're not making any statement at all about the persons of the Godhead. All you're saying is that, all you're talking about is election, that he's our God alone. He doesn't belong to the other nations. He has given himself to us. You're making a statement, a theological one to be sure, but you're making a statement about election. The nation of Israel is elected. God has given himself to them and to no other nation. A statement about election, and not a statement about the ontological existence of God or the persons and distinctions in the Godhead. And I'll just throw this in for free. It doesn't really relate to what we're saying now, but it happens to be the same word, and it's just found scores of times in the Old Testament. And sometimes from the context you can tell it means one, like one apple. Not an apple alone, but one apple. But it's the same word that appears over in Genesis 2, where God says to Moses there that the man shall leave his mother and father and shall cleave unto his wife, and they twain shall become one flesh. Well, is it literally one? You still got two bodies. You still got two flesh there. but a one flesh. And there now it's not speaking of something about like alone, it's speaking of unity with distinction. That they two shall become one. What's the contradiction of terms? That two can become one. And the two always remain two. And yet the one always remains one, though. The two shall become one. There's always distinction. You're still two people with two bodies and two flesh. And then again, you're not. And that's sometimes the way people understand the doctrine, the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. That there are three persons in the Godhead. But then again, they're not, because they are one. They are one in their will, their personality, their outlook, their purpose. They're one in their power. They're one in all their attributes. They're one in their existence. They're one. And yet they're 1 + 1 + 1. So sometimes you're not told by the Jewish people that the same word for one in Deuteronomy 6:4 is also appears in Genesis 2, that the twain shall become one. And we know one, there's not a mathematical oneness, it's a oneness of unity, a oneness of spirit, a oneness of purpose, a oneness of body, but not a mathematical oneness. Not so that two people are just, absorbed and dissolved into one another, so that you blink, and after they say I do, you blink again, and two people have become one. They just melted together and became one. Well, that doesn't happen. There's still two up there. And yet now they're one. Okay? So, anyway, a new translation of the Holy Scriptures according to the Masoretic text, which I think looks like this in a hardback edition anyway. They may have some paperbacks, but I don't have that. Now, no questions on that. With the time we have left, let's cover number 50, which is entitled the New King James Version, 1982. The New King James Version. So it just so happens, and this isn't my own working, this is just the working of how these were published, that we're putting two new editions together. Number 49 was a new translation of a Jewish work already done earlier. Obviously, the New King James Version is a new work of a work already done earlier, the King James Bible of 1611. Now, I probably haven't said a whole lot. You probably haven't heard me say much about this translation over the last few years. But that wasn't because I didn't own my own copy. I do, and I've had it, I think I bought about one of the first copies whenever this was published back in 1982. But I think that the NKJV, which is how it goes by abbreviation, is completely purposeless, as you'll see from some of my descriptions of it. I don't see any purpose in the work having even been done to begin with. It serves no purpose, no discernible one, no purpose that I can see at all, as you'll see from what I say. So I haven't had a lot to say about the New King James Version, but my copy goes back to 1982, so I must have bought one whenever it first came out. Let's discuss its history to begin with, the New King James Bible, or the New King James Version. It is the work of Thomas Nelson Publishers in Nashville. Now this will become important. Generally we don't major on who the publisher was, because maybe different companies, different publishing companies publish, the same edition of the Bible. But this copyright is owned by Thomas Nelson Publishers in Nashville, Tennessee. Now, Thomas Nelson Publishers were also the ones who gave us the ASV of 1901 and the RSV of 1946 and 52. Now, what were the ASVs and RSVs but two departures from the KJV's underlying text? Now, the ASV was a conservative work, and the RSV a liberal work. But both of them were following the new eclectic text of critical scholarship of the last couple of hundred years. The KJV's underlying text was the Textus Receptus. So Thomas Nelson was the one who published ASV and RSV, and others published them, but Thomas Nelson also printed those two Bibles. So we might ask, what is the NKJV then? Penance for their past mistake of departing from the underlying critical text? Because the very name, the New King James Version, sounds like they're going to stay with the same underlying text, the Textus Receptus, and not follow any of the theories of the textual critics like Westcott and Hort. Well, no, this isn't any penance for past mistakes of theirs, because this 180-year-old British company was sold in 1979 to a 50-year-old Lebanese immigrant businessman there in Tennessee, who took the American name Sam Moore. Now, this just happened a few years ago. These Bible and Christian book publishing companies are changing hands, it seems like. Now, this Thomas Nelson goes back to the very early 1800s, a 180-year-old British publishing company. It was sold in 1979 to a 50-year-old Lebanese from Lebanon, an Arab, a Lebanese immigrant businessman. I guess he was rich on oil or rich on supporting terrorists or something over there, and took the American name Sam Moore. Well, that last bib was meant facetiously. Why? Sam Moore is a rabid fundamentalist. He's an Arab. Now he's an American citizen, and he owns Thomas Nelson Publishing Company. He is a rabid fundamentalist. Now, you know what I mean by that terminology in this context. A rabid fundamentalist, a rabid fundamentalist would never depart from the Textus Receptus. It would never really depart from the KJV except to make it the new KJV. Would never think of publishing something else in the place of the KJV, which has stood the test of time and been the backbone of fundamentalism for all these years, and conservatism for all these centuries. What Moore wanted to do, he felt it was a personal calling of God for him. Now, he's supposedly a born-again Christian. I guess if you're a rabid fundamentalist, you'd have to be saved, because you'd have everything to lose to be a fundamentalist today, unless you're a fundamentalist from your heart and in your heart. I don't know much about the man. I just know that that's it. I don't even know his Lebanese Arab name. I just know his an American name that he took, Sam Moore. Real common, Sam Moore. That's an easy name to remember. Old Sam Moore, old rich Sam Moore, who owns Thomas Nelson. What he wanted to do, he felt God had given him a calling, and this was his mission, to do something personally. That's why he bought the company, to do something personally about the influx of all of these wicked modern translations. You know, like today's English version and the Living Bible and the RSV, those that left out the blood and changed the text and didn't agree with the KJV and all this business. Now, Moore had a son who asked him, "Dad, you make a lot of Bibles in your company. Why don't you do one that I can understand?" Now, that reads similar to Kenneth Taylor in the Living Bible. So he enlisted 119 scholars from various denominational backgrounds to work on the New King James Version. And they started to work they bought the company in 79 and started to work in 79 and produced part of their work in 79. There wasn't any playing around with this endeavor right here, contrary to these other things we've looked at. Like this Jewish work, number 49, we just got through with, the New Testament. The Torah came out in 1963, and we've got to wait 2 decades before the whole thing is through. You won't have to wait that long for old Sam Moore's work. You got to picture him the way he is. He's just totally anti all this liberalism in the Living Bible and today's English version and, the good news for modern man. He's against all of that. And he wants the old fundamentalists, fire and brimstone, revivalistic type translation. He wants one of the old ones, the standard one. And so he enlists all these scholars. Now you might say, 119 men from various denominational backgrounds. That doesn't sound like a fundamentalist. Well, before he'd let you work on his Bible, you had to take an oath and swear and sign a statement that you believed in plenary, confluent, verbal inspiration. He's even got all the terms there. You have to believe in this. And so the people who worked on the NKJV are themselves dyed-in-the-wool fundamentalists and evangelicals. They had to take an oath and swear. Now, some of those scholars should have been reading Matthew 5 and James 5 They're going to translate the Bible. It doesn't do any good if you don't live it yourself. But they took an oath and swore they would believe in and practice and not deviate from what is consistent with confluent plenary verbal inspiration. See, I have the people behind this picture like those who did that eye-opener tract. You know, oh, you took the blood out, and you don't believe in the blood, and you don't believe in this, and, well, they got some points, as we discussed with today's English version, but they're kind of strange, though. They kind of get hyper, is what I say. They get hyper. They just forget some things. But that's all right. That's forgivable. I guess it's better to be like that than to be like these modern people and liberal people who don't seem to have any care what's put in or what's taken out. So the New Testament was begun and came out in 1979. I mean, I've never known a Bible translating committee like this one. That's the year that he bought the company, friends, 1979. It takes a few years to hire your accountants and get everything ready and then start a new project and do some marketing and consulting and questioning here and there. He just says, we ain't doing any of that. He felt that it was a personal mission and calling of his to put out a Bible. If people aren't going to read the KJV because it's outdated language, I'll update the language so I can still keep people reading the only holy Word of God. You know, he'd be the person who'd say something like, if it was good enough for the Apostle Paul, it's good enough for us today. It'd be that type of rabid fundamentalist idea. The entire Bible came out in 1982 at a cost of $3.5 million. I don't know why Bibles cost so much. Just get you some old parchment or skin a lamb and stretch your skin out and dip some soot out of your chimney or something and just start writing on it. But we understand. But $3.5 million, The scholars don't ever get paid for anything, remember. I don't know where all the money goes. All right, here's some features. That was the history. Here are some features of the NKJV. I've had at least a couple of you over the last few years ask me about that. You know, you don't ever mention that Bible. You mention these other. Don't you have that, or what's wrong with it? And the reason I've had it all along, but I just haven't mentioned it because there's nothing to mention about it. As you'll see with some of these comments I'm going to make concerning its features. First of all, one feature. It is so rare in these days to find a major Bible publish that throws to the wind the last 200 years of textual critical studies. That is so rare. You know, all the other Bibles are following the advance in textual science and criticism. They're looking for the better manuscripts, the ancient manuscripts, and not just a large number of late Byzantine manuscripts. So the NKJV is a rare bird in this regard. Completely unique. To see a major Bible. I mean, it's a major work. This isn't like Treat Me Cool, Lord, or something, some small time. This is a major work here. And for them to throw to the wind the last 200 years of textual and critical studies in advance is rare indeed. But the NKJV does that. For the Old Testament, they follow the Masoretic text. They don't believe in any of that comparing with the Septuagint or Symmachus or Theodotion or Aquila or any work like that, or even Dead Sea Scrolls. They believe that you follow what the church has always followed, the Masoretic text. And you follow, for the New Testament, the TR, the Textus Receptus. That is a very rare feature to be found in a modern translation. No other Bible is like that. Secondly, another feature, it does update the language and the spelling of the KJV. And really, I think that was its only purpose. It doesn't change anything, but it updates the spelling and the language. Especially things, you know, like your verb endings, your TH or EST on the end of your verbs. They update all of that. You don't have runneth anymore. You just have runs. He runs. He not runneth somewhere. You have all those things. Or saith becomes says. Or said. Especially verb endings and other things. But it updates the language and the spelling of the KJV. In the third place, and here's something that's rather inexplicable, when we see how conservative and everything this Bible is supposed to be, it was first issued in a brilliant orange binding. Now when you leave church, you can look at that used car lot down there at the bottom of the hill, and they got a van out there for sale. And I think it looks about like what this Bible used to look like. There's an old flower children's van down there. Bright, brilliant orange. Almost like a hunter's orange, fluorescent orange. Now, why not the traditional black? I mean, this is a traditional, conservative, like the old ways book here. It reminds you of the RSV, the old commie red RSV, whenever they printed their first Bible in brilliant red. And people suspected right away, I knew the communists were behind this Bible. And look, they given us a red Bible. Well, I don't know exactly if orange is the national color in Lebanon or what it is, but it's not really going to go over very well with people to print a brilliant orange Bible. I mean, you're going to think right away, hey, man, cool, this is a new translation here. You'd never think this is sacred, holy King James Version between two hunter orange, fluorescent orange covers. You would never expect that. I don't know why they did that. That's inexplicable to me. Your whole purpose is going to backfire on you now. The only people that will buy that will be the people who want a modern, up-to-date, contemporary translation, not people who are rabid fundamentalists or rabid evangelicals who want to stay with the old way in the KJV. And so that didn't sell very well. And so, as with the RSV, the next Bible was completely black. Now, I happen to own a brown one. As you go along, you can, turn it brown. But the best thing is print your Bibles black. People will read them if they're black. Now, I don't know why that ever had to get started in the first place. It's a book of light and life. It should be gold or white or, well, the first Bible I ever owned was white with gold edges on it. I was given that as a 4-year-old. A lot of good it did me then as an unsaved heathen 4-year-old, but that was the first KJV, first Bible I ever owned. I still have it, white cover. Of course, it's all dingy now. I wrote on it and practiced crown scribbling on it. And with gold edges. That's the way all Bibles ought to be. Don't you agree? White with gold edges. Or maybe, green that speaks of the tree of life. Black that speaks of the bottomless pit, the abyss. But you've got to have a black Bible, wear a black suit, drive a black car, paint your church black, to be a Christian today. Well, not today, but in the old days anyway. That doesn't make any sense. At least churches were painted white, at least up here, but everything else had to be black. Black minister, black robe, black hair, black shoes, black tie, black, dull, boring, and a black Bible. So that's why I guess I pick my Bibles that I generally own, like my KJV I carry around is brown. I just try to get something that's not black. Don't have any problem with the black one. I got some other black ones, but you just look at that and you think, this is a book on light and life. And why be the color of the devil and the color of the abyss? Well, a fourth feature of this Bible, they print each verse as a separate paragraph. Now that follows the KJV style of printing every verse as a separate paragraph. But if the verse doesn't truly start the next thought, then the first letter of that verse is in lowercase. Small b, small a, small t, small m. If that verse doesn't begin a new thought. Well, no sense in giving you an example. They're on every page. But you know what I mean. Every verse is going to be, you're going to have it over here on the left-hand side. You're going to have a number like verse 2, verse 3, verse 4. Every verse will be separated as though it were a paragraph on its own, like the KJV does. But if it's really not the beginning of a new paragraph, then the first letter of the sentence will start with a small or lower case. Then in the fifth place, the words of Christ are printed in red. Now this is often done by many Bibles, but you generally don't find red in places like, now you can check your Bible. I happen to have one KJV that does have red in these places. You're going to find red in the Gospels. But the Bible that I use now, I don't have red for some strange reason. I don't have red in Revelation chapters 1, 2, and 3. Jesus speaking to the churches there. Now, I think maybe some of you have Bibles that are printed in red if they're the words of Christ. The one I use and the ones I've used over the last few years don't print that in red. And then there are some even more hidden places like Acts 20 and the end of verse 35. Paul says, remember the words of the Lord Jesus that he said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. Acts 20 and verse 35. That's often not found in red. The Bible that I use, it's not in red. New King James, it's in red. If Jesus said it, he said it. We're going to call your attention to it. It's in red. And one that's even a little stranger than that is 2 Corinthians 12:9. Paul's praying to Jesus about the thorn in the flesh, and Jesus said, all red, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. I would say that's generally not true in a lot of Bibles, to find, even if it's a red letter Bible, to find those verses printed in red. Let me move on a few things to conclude with beyond the features. Some of the claims by the publisher, Thomas Nelson and Sam Moore, have simply been outrageous and untrue. I copied down a couple of quotes in some of their advertising. So we're back to advertising again. Here was one of their claims. The NKJV is the most important event in religious publishing in this century. Well, says who? Well, Thomas Nelson, I guess, because you want people to buy it. The most important event in religious publishing in this century? Oh, come on now. That's rather pompous and presumptuous. I would say that's outrageous to make a claim like that. I'd say it'd be impossible to make a claim. Are you going to say NIV, or what about ASV, or what translation, or maybe it doesn't have to be a Bible translation, maybe it's just a book on doctrine or theology. That's the most important publishing event, religious publishing in this century. It'd be very difficult to pick anything. And here's another claim that they made in their advertising, which is not only outrageous, it's a lie. The NKJV is, I quote, the first major revision of the KJV since 1867. It's the first major revision of the KJV since 1867. That is a patent falsehood.